28,000 feet above the European continent on March 6, 1940, for the freezing air was a physical force, a relentless tide of invisible icy razors slashing furiously against the aluminum skin of the aircraft. In this dead silent altitude where temperatures plummeted to 50 degrees below zero, the simple act of drawing a breath became a brutal gamble with the Grim Reaper. Just a few months prior, the arrogant iron-crossed decorated fighter races of the German Luftwaffe had been clogging the open radio channels with their derisive laughter. They openly mocked a new American fighter plane, dismissing it as sluggish, agonizingly slow, and utterly harmless, a flying target practice drone not worthy of their time. Piloting their vastly superior Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s, they would peer down with utter contempt at these American machines struggling in the lower altitudes, viewing them as nothing more than scrap metal waiting to happen. To the German aerial knights, these planes did not even qualify as prey. Yet when the heavy grinding gears of history finally slammed into place, on that fateful day in March, all the arrogance, all the mockery, and all the laughter that had echoed across the European skies instantly froze, shattered, and dissolved into a bone-chilling, suffocating silence. Because on that single ordinary day, exactly 200 of those once ridiculed fighters materialized like a massive silver broadsword from pure, unadulterated vengeance. They violently tore through the thick, leaden clouds over the Third Reich's capital, descending with an unstoppable, wrathful momentum. This was not merely the combat debut of a new aircraft. This was the bloodiest, most absolute reversal of fortune in the entire European air war. This machine was a demon forged in the fires of necessity, born specifically to end a terrifying slaughter that had been feeding thousands of young American boys into an inescapable meat grinder. To understand the sheer magnitude of this moment, we must brutally rewind the clock to the late autumn of 1943. Back then, the skies over Fortress Europe were a freezing zone of absolute death, a terrifying tapestry woven from flying steel, aviation fuel, fires, and spilled blood. On the muddy, rain-soaked field strips of Great Britain, every dawn brought the heavy stench of high-octane AVG as a suffocating blanket of dread. The young men of the United States Air Force were trapped in what felt like a cursed, endless loop of despair. Barely out of their teens, these boys would shoehorn themselves into the cramped, freezing, oil-slicked fuselages of the massive B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-20 for Liberators. The orders scrawled on the briefing room blackboards were deceptively simple, crisp, and almost tragically romantic: fly in broad daylight, form massive, tight defensive combat boxes, strike straight into the industrial heart of the Third Reich, and drop thousands of tons of high explosives to obliterate Germany's ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, and war machine. But the reality was a script written in severed limbs and burning debris at 25,000 feet. At an altitude where the blood in your veins could literally freeze in seconds, the interiors of these heavy bombers offered zero heating. Her massive radial engines roared with a deafening, dull, and rattling mechanical scream that vibrated right through a man's organs. The gunners had to wear thick, electrically heated suits and heavy gloves, because if bare skin touched the freezing metal barrel of a .50 caliber machine gun, the flesh would instantly bond to the steel and be violently torn away. Yet the physical torture was absolutely nothing compared to the psychological collapse that awaited them. As the massive bomber formations labored over the English Channel and crossed the French coastline, a sickening countdown began in every airman's mind. Through frost-choked plexiglass blisters, they could only watch in agonizing despair as their escorts, the fighter planes they entirely depended on for survival, began to peel away one by one. The P-47 Thunderbolt escorts were massive, heavily armored, and packed devastating firepower. They were practically flying tanks. But against the cold, hard laws of physics, they were hopelessly outmatched. Their gargantuan Pratt & Whitney, our 2,800 double wasp engines, were prehistoric beasts that guzzled fuel at a terrifying rate. After escorting the bombers just 200 or 300 miles into hostile territory, the fighter pilots would watch their fuel gauges slam against the red line of death. With heavy hearts and apologetic sighs crackling over the radio, The Thunderbolt pilots would dip their heavy wings in a final solemn salute to their bomber brothers, push the throttles and dive back toward the English coast. Flying even 1 minute further meant running their tanks, dry and plummeting, into enemy territory as dead weight. The twin-engine P-38 Lightnings could fly slightly further, but in the extreme freezing altitudes of Europe, their complex cooling systems frequently failed, leaving pilots half-frozen in unheated cockpits and forcing them to turn back as well. As the last silver glint of the escort fighters faded into the western horizon, a suffocating, terrifying silence wrapped around the bomber formation. For the next 2 hours or even longer, these slow, lumbering beasts, stuffed to the brim with highly volatile aviation fuel and high explosives, were forced to push forward completely naked into the gap of death, a stretch of airspace that every bomber crew recognized as pure hell. The Germans knew exactly what was happening. The highly experienced, blood-soaked aces of the Luftwaffe were sitting comfortably in warm, alert huts, drinking coffee and listening to the precise tracking reports from their ground radar stations. They didn't even bother to waste a single drop of aviation fuel intercepting the formations early on. Like a pack of ravenous wolves smelling blood in the water, they waited patiently, circling over their own cities and factories, locking their eyes onto this massive, wounded prey. The moment the German radar controllers confirmed that the American escorts had departed, the order to slaughter was given. Suddenly the sky erupted with a horrifying mechanical roar. Upwards of 100 Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf F-190s mixed with heavy twin-engine Bf-110s packing air-to-air rockets swarmed the bombers from every conceivable angle, dropping out of the blinding sun like a tidal wave of black iron. There was no preamble to the violence. The German fighters charged head-on at relative closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, the leading edges of their wings spitting lethal streams of fire. They utilized 20mm 30mm NGE shells, terrifying ordnance packed with massive amounts of high explosives that acted like flying scythes, effortlessly tearing through the aluminum skin of the B-17s. The very first pass could shear a wing clean off a bomber, shatter the cockpit's armored glass, or detonate the payload of bombs right inside the belly. The sky would instantly bloom with blinding tangerine-colored fireballs, the massive shockwaves tossing adjacent bombers around like dead leaves in a hurricane. The radio frequencies dissolved into a nightmare of desperate screams, the relentless hammering of defensive machine guns, the agonizing shrieks of dying engines, and the sickening sound of metal tearing as fuselages broke apart in mid-air. During the period known as Black Thursday, Allied losses reached a scale that broke the human spirit. In a single raid on the Schweinfurt ball-bearing factories, 60 heavy bombers were utterly obliterated, plunging into the cold German earth and taking over 600 young American men, with them denying them any chance of ever returning home. The surviving bombers were little more than flying perforated graves. Crews stood ankle-deep in spent brass casings, and the blood of their friends desperately swinging their Browning machine guns in a futile attempt to fight off the swarm. The brutal mathematics of the air war dictated a terrifying truth that the current attrition rate of bomber crew had to fly only 7 missions before their statistical chance of survival dropped to 0. Buried beneath the smoking wreckage and the tragic casualty reports was a terrifying reality that the Allied HICM and desperately wanted to ignore. They had bet the entire outcome of the war on daylight precision bombing, and that gamble was sliding irreversibly into catastrophic failure simply because they lacked a fighter plane that could go the distance. The war machine was screaming for a miracle, a completely new, almost scientifically impossible super fighter. It needed to be agile enough to outturn the finest German aces, rugged enough to fight flawlessly in the 50 below's aerostratosphere, and most impossibly of all, it needed a staggering combat radius of over 1,000 miles. It had to fight its way to Berlin and fight its way back. To the aeronautical engine ears of the era, this was a pipe dream. No single aircraft could combine the holy trinity of speed, maneuverability, and extreme range within a small single-engine airframe. The dawn that would eventually solve this hopeless nightmare washed, even on the military's radar. The plane that would ultimately rewrite the history of World War II and save the free world was initially considered a disposable, after-thought a failed experiment tossed into the dark corner of a hangar by the United States Army Air Forces. The birth of the P-51 Mustang is an engineering miracle wrapped in profound irony. The story actually begins in 1940, the British Royal Air Force fighting for its very survival under the relentless bombardment of Nazi Germany was desperate for any weapon that could take to the skies. The British Purchasing Commission approached the American manufacturer, North American Aviation, asking them to build the aging P-40 fighter under a license agreement. But Dutch Kindleberger, the brilliantly ambitious president of North America, made a wildly audacious counter-offer. In a cramped hotel room, he looked the British in the eye and refused the contract. Instead, he promised that in the exact same amount of time it would take to set up the P-40 assembly line, his team could design and build a brand new, vastly superior fighter plane from the ground up. It was a lunatic gamble. The engineers at North American worked like men possessed, burning the midnight oiland. In a mind-boggling 102 days, they dragged the blueprints into reality and rolled out the first prototype. From the moment it left the factory floor, the aircraft was a vision of lethal beauty. Possessed remarkably sleek aerodynamic lines with no unnecessary protrusions. The engineers had fitted it with a revolutionary laminar flow wing. The cross-section of this wing had been calculated with such extreme precision that the air flowing over it remained impossibly smooth, reducing aerodynamic drag to the absolute limit of what 1940s technology could achieve. During low-altitude test flights, it handled like a dream-fast razor-sharp, cutting through the air like a hot knife through butter. It was a pure flying machine that British pilots instantly fell in love with, gifting it the wild and tamed name Mustang. But deadly beauty doesn't win wars at 30,000 feet. The heart of the early Mustang was the Allison V1710 liquid-cooled engine. It was a rugged, highly reliable piece of machinery, but it was never designed for the brutal environment of the stratosphere. Below 15,000 feet, the plane fought like a champion gladiator. But the moment it attempted to climb into the thin, freezing air above 20,000 feet to protect the bombers, disaster struck. The Allison engine possessed a pathetic single-stage supercharger that acted like a failing lung. It simply could not ram enough oxygen into the cylinders in the thin atmosphere. The engine would gasp, violently vibrate, and lose power at a terrifying rate. In the high-altitude arenas where the bombers were bleeding out, the Mustang went from a galloping stallion to a sluggish mule, completely incapable of defending itself. This was exactly why the early German pilots laughed at it. ABF-109 or FW-190 could effortlessly climb thousands of feet above the struggling Mustang, hoarding a massive energy advantage. They would circle above the Americans like hawks, playing with wounded mice, waiting for the perfect boring moment to push their noses down, use gravity to accelerate into a lethal firing pass and pull back up into the safety of the heights. The Mustang's oxygen-starved engine could not provide the thrust to evade, let alone turn the tables and fight back. It could not protect the bombers, and it could barely protect itself. The top brass at the United States Army Air Forces were deeply disappointed. This gorgeous machine was brutally labeled a high-altitude failure and tossed into the reject pile. It was relegated to secondary tactical roles, strapping bombs to its belly for low-level ground attacks or bolting cameras to it for photo reconnaissance. Its destiny seemed entirely written off while the bombers continued to fall in droves over Germany, turning the clouds red with blood. The machine that was supposed to be the savior was abandoned because of a flawed heart. If it were not for a tiny handful of speed-obsessed engineers and test pilots, the story would have ended right there in the scrapyard. These mavericks possessed the vision to see the unfathomable potential hiding beneath the so-called failure's perfect aerodynamic skin. The problem was not the airframe, the problem was the heartbeat. The solution was incredibly simple, blunt, and yet so audacious, it bordered on aeronautical heresy. What if the airframe was actually perfect and everyone else was just wrong? The turning point arrived in the form of a legendary British Royal Air Force test pilot named Ronnie Harker. After squeezing himself into the cockpit of an early Mustang and feeling its lightning-fast reflexes and the blinding acceleration provided by the laminar flow wing at low altitude, he was absolutely stunned. He did not write a long bureaucratic report when he landed. Instead, he fired off a short, blunt memorandum that carried the weight of an absolute command, a single sentence that fundamentally altered the trajectory of human history, put a Merlin in it. The Rolls-Royce Merlin, this was not just a piece of industrial equipment. This was the most aggressive, technologically advanced high-altitude piston engine ever created by man. It was the very soul of the legendary Supermarine Spitfire mechanical beast Taylor, made for the vicious, freezing dogfights of the upper atmosphere. The secret to its absolute dominance was bolted to the back of the engine, a highly complex to-stage-to-speed supercharger. This system was an engineering marvel, acting as an incredibly powerful set of mechanical lungs. As the aircraft climbed into the dead air at 20 or 30,000 feet, the impellers inside the supercharger would spin at a mind-bending tens of thousands of revolutions per minute. They would violently compress the thin outside air, forcibly shoving massive amounts of dense, highly oxygenated air directly down the throat of the cylinders. While the old Allison engine choked on its own blood, at high altitudes the Merlin engine would open its mechanical jaws and roar with devastating, unrestricted power in the domain of the dead. On paper, however, this was a terrifyingly Frankenstein-less proposition. You could not just yank out the old engine and drop the new one in like a backyard mechanic. The Merlin was longer, heavier, and completely different in shape. Shoving this monstrous power plant into the slender, streamlined nose of the Mustang required engine ears to radically deconstruct and redesign the entire front half of the airplane. The center of gravity would shift violently, the complex cooling systems had to be entirely rerouted, and the nose cowling needed to be completely re-sculpted. If they miscalculated by even a fraction of an inch, the Mustang's legendary balance would be destroyed, its low-drag aerodynamics would be ruined, and the plane might just flip into a fireball at the end of the runway. The entire project would become a laughingstock, but the meat grinder of the war was turning too fast, and thousands of telegrams were arriving at American doorsteps every day. Time was completely out by late 1940 to a joint team of American and British engineers executed a desperate sprint. Miraculously, they sculpted a new nose shoehorned the mighty Merlin inside and brilliantly designed a massive gaping air scoop beneath the belly to solve the immense schooling problems. When the first Merlin-powered P-51 prototype rolled out onto the tarmac, its engine emitting a deep guttural growl completely unlike any American fighter before it, no one holding their breath knew if they had just unleashed a masterpiece or a fatal disaster. The test flight results were not just a success, they were an immediate, violent, and terrifying display of absolute superiority. When the test pilot pushed the throttle and aimed for the 30,000-foot mark, the new Mustang did not just survive the climb. It treated the freezing stratosphere like its natural hunting ground. At an altitude that previously left it gasping, its top speed jumped by nearly 100 miles per hour, redlining at an astonishing 440 miles per hour. It rocketed upward like a missile, rolling and turning with an arrogant, untouchable grace. Those high-flying German aces who used to pick off Mustangs for sport would soon find themselves trapped in a living nightmare, outrun, completely outclimbed, maneuvered in every conceivable metric. This was not a technical upgrade, it was a mechanical resurrection, a divine intervention against the Luftwaffe. Yet fate loves to place the most agonizing hurdles right before the finish line. Having the speed and agility to rule the high altitudes was not enough to save the bombers burning deep inside Germany. The final, most brutal physical barrier remained range. Even with the sleek aerodynamics and the highly efficient Merlin engine, the Mustang's internal fuel capacity was tragically small. The massive drop tanks hanging under the wings helped, but they were not nearly enough to guarantee a round trip of 1,000 miles. The bombers needed a fighter that could stay glued to them from the English coast to the target and all the way back. To bridge this final gap, the engineers at North American made a decision so reckless and unconventional, it made test pilots physically shudder. They literally hollowed out a space directly behind the pilot's armored C-Trite at the razor edge of the aircraft's center of gravity and brutally jammed a massive 85-gallon aviation fuel tank into the fuselage. In the strict science of aerodynamics, this was absolute taboo. The moment that rear tank was filled with heavy AVG as the entire aircraft became dangerously tail-heavy. Its center of gravity violently shifted backward, inducing a sickly hyper-unstable flight condition that was perpetually on the verge of spinning out of control. During takeoff and the initial climb, the plane handled like a genuinely bucking psychotic bronco. If a pilot engaged in even the mildest evasive maneuver or dogfight with a full rear tank, the Mustang would instantly snap into a flat spin, ripping the plane out of the sky before the pilot could even think about bailing out. Because of this, every young pilot trapping into this ultimate weapon was given a cold and forgiving mandate discipline over survival. During the long, agonizing cruise toward Germany, they had to fight their own terror. Until they engaged the enemy, they were ordered to exclusively burn the fuel from that ticking time bomb strapped to their backs. Until the tank was more than half empty and the center of gravity settled forward, they were absolutely from engaging in any aggressive combat maneuvers, no matter how desperately the Germans provoked them. It was a terrifying psychological tightrope, walk between life and death, carrying an explosive anchor into hostile territory just to buy enough mileage to shield their brothers in the bombers. With the weapon finally perfected, the last piece of the puzzle fell into place, a nuclear explosion of tactical philosophy that would directly sign the death warrant of the German Air Force. In early 1940, the 8th Air Force received a new commander, a man whose very name struck fear into the Nazi Heichem and General Jimmy Doolittle. This was the legendary hardliner who had flown Army bombers off the deck of an aircraft carrier to strike Tokyo early in the war. Doolittle despised passive defense in his bones. He absolutely refused to believe that you could win a war by simply providing a bodyguard detail for the bombers. Immediately upon taking command, and he violently tore up the old rulebook that stated escort fighters had to stay strictly tied to the bomber formations and never give chase. He strode into the pilot briefing rooms, his eyes locking on to the young fighter jocks, and delivered a new, ice-cold, blood-soaked directive. It was not just a tactic, it became the only religion of the 8th Air Force. Your job is no longer to protect the bombers, your job is to find the enemy, attack them, and destroy them. With those words famously summarized on a calcboard as "destroy the enemy," the Mustang was finally unchained. Its ease to be a heavy, defensive shield, it transformed into a blindingly fast assassin's blade, actively seeking the throat of the Luftwaffe. When the veteran German pilots took to the skies in their Bf-109s and Def-W-190s, arrogant and ready for another day of slaughtering unprotected bombers, they were met with a paralyzing shock. The rules of engagement over Europe had been obliterated overnight. They were not facing P-47s that had to turn back, nor were they facing escorts chained to the slow bombers. Instead, they looked up to see hundreds upon hundreds of gleaming silver P-51 Mustangs diving out of the blinding sun like angels of death. The roar of the Merlins shattered the sky as the Americans initiated aggressive, hyper-violent, and completely relentless attacks. Worse still, these silver ghosts seemed to possess infinite fuel. They escorted the bombers all the way to Berlin, and then, rather than fleeing, they lingered. They loitered deep inside German airspace, hunting down anything with a swastika painted on it with ruthless prejudice. As if this was not lethal enough, American industry handed the Mustang one final god-like technological advantage: the K-14 computing gyroscopic gunsight. In the chaotic, terrifyingly fast blur of a high-altitude dogfight, calculating a target's trajectory, the drop of gravity, and the precise deflection angle required to land a shot was an art form reserved for the absolute elite aces. K-14 turned that dark art into an automated assembly line of death. Young green American pilots simply had to dial the enemy's wingspan into the throttle grip, place a projected ring of light over the German fighter, and let the mechanical brain inside the gunsight calculate the exact firing solution. When the diamond of light hovered over the target, they squeezed the trigger. Even rookies fresh out of flight school were instantly transformed into flawless, inescapable aerial snipers. The unprecedented range, the complete dominance of high-altitude speed and energy, the fleshed-airing power of 650 caliber M2 heavy machine guns and a computer Bray naming the shots, it was the ultimate apocalypse for the German Air Force. Which brings us back to March 6, 1940 for the most epic and bloody turning point in the history of aerial warfare. As the deafening air raid sirens wailed across the center of Berlin and the citizens of the Reich looked up, they witnessed an apocalyptic nightmare. Massive armades of B-17 and B-24 bombers blotted out the sun. But flying high above them, no longer leaving them vulnerable, were 200 silver P-51 Mustangs flying in perfect arrogant formation, claiming absolutes over the capital of the Third Reich. Every laugh, every sneer ever directed at this airplane was pulverized by the thunderous shockwaves of the Merlin engines. The Luftwaffe scrambled their very best, their final elite reserves, in a desperate bid to survive. Flak filled the sky with black, oily clouds of shrapnel, and the radio was a mess of screaming German voices. As the interceptors moved and the Mustang pilots acted in perfect unison, 200 American pilots reached down and yanked the drop-ank release handles. A metallic rain of external fuel tanks tumbled toward the earth. Freed of their drag, the pure, violent nature of the fighter was unleashed. The pilots slammed the throttles forward, the superchargers force-fed oxygen into the engines, and the Merlin screamed a high-pitched battle cry. It was an absolute massacre. The sky was violently painted with contrails, and the blinding flashes of sunlight reflecting off twisting aluminum. The Mustangs, utilizing their supreme high altitude, turning radius, easily slipped into the blind spots of the German fighters. 6 heavy machine guns opened up simultaneously on each plane, vomiting long, continuous streams of armor-piercing and incendiary tracers directly into the cockpits and engines of the 109s and 190s. One by one, the German planes were sawed to pieces in mid-air, disintegrating into tumbling balls of fire that plummeted screaming into the ruins of Berlin. Parachutes bloomed in panic, but countless more never even had the chance to bail out. Mustangs did not just slaughter the last of the Luftwaffe's veteran aces in the stratosphere, bleeding dry a talent pool that took years to build. Following Doolittle's ruthless orders, these blood-drunk silver hunters pushed their noses down and screamed toward the earth. Flying right on the deck, clipping the treetops, they transformed into the Grim Reaper, violently strafing German airfields and turning parked aircraft into blazing infernos before they could even start their engines. They hunted down supply trains along the railways, using armor-piercing rounds to detonate the boilers of steam locomotives, completely paralyzing the Nazi logistical spine. It was this absolute total domination from the freezing heights of the stratosphere down to the dirt that broke the back of the German war machine. Because the P-51 Mustang had swept the skies entirely clean, the monumental D-Day invasion, just months later, could proceed without a single German aircraft table could contest the airspace. From a mocked and discarded failure to an engineering masterpiece born from a radical engine swap, the P-51 Mustang, fueled by raw mechanical genius, the razor-sharp instincts of test pilots, and the fearless sacrifice of its young flyers, brutally grabbed the arc of World War II and bent it toward victory. When we look up at the peaceful skies today, we no longer hear the deafening scream of the Rolls-Royce Merlin, but trapped forever inside the perfect aerodynamic lines of that silver airframe is an immortal legend of a desperate fight for survival, human courage, and the absolute pinnacle of mechanical warfare. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history, as deadliest miscalculations, smash that like button and subscribe. I am your strategy observer. I will see you on the next battlefield.